Hey, and welcome to another NX show. My name is Yuri Schrumpflohner. I'm the Director of Developer Experience here at Nowell, as many of you know. And today I'm super excited because today we have kind of a very special guest. We're talking all about Webpack Module Federation, which some that have been following along kind of know that we are very into it recently. Like we have published a couple of videos, blog posts about it. We've talked on the last NX show with Colin about how we integrate that into our stack. But today we have Zack Jackson, which is kind of the creator of Module Federation in Webpack, right? So very excited about that. And so let's dive in. So yeah, welcome Zack to the show. And why don't you introduce yourself, quickly kind of mention what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and yeah, let people know.
Yeah. My name is Zach, and I'm a principal engineer at Lululemon. I pretty much day to day oversee all of the JavaScript engineering across the company. Um, and I think a lot of my time there is spent in architecture design, scale, and finding strategic levers in open source where we've got good synergy with the company and good synergy with the community.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And I think in your Twitter handle, you also mentioned you're one of the maintainers of Webpack itself as well, right?
Yes.
How did that come to be? How did you end up actually being a maintainer? Because I think a lot of us use Webpack on a daily basis, right? Sometimes even not noticing because it's so long and mature over the years now. But how did you become a maintainer?
So I guess I think probably in 2014 or so, I don't know, that's when I first started using Webpack. And before then it was like Gulp and Grunt and those
Yeah,
type of things.
been there as well.
And then Webpack came out and I'm like, oh wow, an omniscient tool that understands every asset in the pipeline and can correlate things in ways we haven't been able to before. So, I started using it avidly then. And I think back then we were in like Webpack 1 or whatever. And since Webpack 1, we've been patching like various little bugs and other random things that we had found in it. And, as my career went on, I just went deeper and deeper into the build ecosystem because the deeper you go into it, kind of the more power you can derive out of your code base. And so things really kind of started to pick up steam with, I think in 2015, I owned a library called React Universal, um, and it was kind of the first code split SSR tool out there for React and server rendering and all of that.
Hmm.
Part of that ecosystem was we had Webpack Flush chunks and we had Extract CSS chunks Webpack plugin. And anyway, so how I ended up getting into Webpack was Extract CSS chunks had the ability to do hot reloading of CSS, and many CSS did not have it at the time. And so I actually went to plug my package on Mini CSS's like repo and Webpack's docs. Said, hey, if you want Mini CSS plus hot reloading, use my package instead. And they were like, well, why don't you just merge it into Mini CSS? And so I used that as my opportunity, and I was like, well, I don't really maintain things that I'm not part of, so
Mm,
if I can get into the Webpack Foundation, I'm more than happy to move all my work over and start maintaining it primarily. And that's how I
nice.
got in. And then I think about a year after that, I opened up the proposal for, at the time we called it, I think, module interleaving. That was the original name for it.
Hmm.
And then from there, we were, I had this thing called extract. What was it? Webpack external import. It's the Webpack 4 version that was kind of my prototype of Federation. So once it was functional, then yeah, I kind of just opened up a big proposal about why we should have this. And since we were doing the Webpack 5 rewrite anyway, we did have to change quite a lot of Webpack to get it to work in the late stage, which is why Webpack was delayed an extra 6 months. But um, my bad. But, it was the perfect time to do it since we're already making major changes to the core. And that's kind of how, everything got going. And since then, um, yeah, the community just kind of pulls me back into the Webpack space. And from writing that, I know the core so well now that I mostly just orbit around the Webpack stuff. Once you understand it, it's a lot easier than it looks from the outside. And so you just kind of gravitate toward what you know.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally. I can totally see that. Yeah, I've been around the Gulp times as well, and even Grunt times. So I've seen that transition. I remember still like when looking at Webpack initially, that was like, it kind of looks weird. But then like a lot of people really like those that tried it, right, kind of stick to it because it's so simple, right? That's what you wanted it to do, and then obviously it has some learning curve as most of those tools have, right? But nowadays, like especially like we from now like do a lot of also consulting in big enterprises, and the thing is like Webpack is very mature, right? There's a lot of tools out there and they're very appealing. And we also use a lot of them, like Vite and stuff that he has built, right? But still a lot of, especially big corporations go to Webpack because you have that like long time, like it has been around for a long time, right? And over time, we know like those things become mature and it's still very performant. And so it's a very, very good
It's
thing.
also I believe, one of the most funded projects in open source. So that's like one of
Oh,
the
yeah.
main reasons why I stick to it is um, it's got the money behind it, and it's been around forever, and it can do pretty much anything you want with any format. Like, I find everybody complains that Webpack's like slower, which I mean, I understand it's a full JavaScript thing, but also if you look at the API, there's so much that you can do with it. And it depends on what you're trying to use the bundler for. If you just need a bundler to transpile ES6 to ES5, a lot of the other tools will do a very good job, and they'll do it faster.
Yeah.
But the areas that I've run into problems is when the bundler doesn't do what I need right out of the box, writing extensions or enhancements for it are a lot more complicated. Or um, not even complicated, they're usually simpler, but the simplicity is the problem, where I don't have something like the biggest one is I don't have a concept of a module factory. So if I need to create like a phantom module that doesn't actually exist on disk, you can kind of write a new module into something like, say, rollup, but there's no real dependency factory around creating something that will derive a certain module type. You mostly can just return
Yeah.
a string that's JavaScript. So, it depends on what you're doing, but for me, I'm usually everything that I'm doing is high in the orchestration space, and the other bundlers just don't have the API for me to build out what I need. And I think a lot of people don't realize about Webpack isn't just a build tool, it's also the runtime orchestrator. So when you write plugins or loaders, you have the ability to have I call it like a trifecta communication layer, where during build, the loader can set up communication pathways for the plugin, and the plugin can set up runtime modules for when it's executing. So now I can have loaders during build write information that at runtime Webpack can read, and they essentially can work together where the build is setting up how the living, breathing application is going to run, and when it's running, it's reading information that the build gave it and can coordinate with other parts of the things that it had set up. So what the build isn't aware of at build time doesn't have to be. It can prep the stage and pass over a series of things to the runtime where it can
Mm-hmm.
look at the
Mm-hmm.
pieces of information that couldn't be derived statically, and now it's got all the other metadata from certain parts of the build to do that final step of execution and draw it together. So, like,
Yeah.
when I'm
Yeah.
building an application, the way I think of it is the Webpack runtime is just as much of a feature as the feature code my developers write. There's not much difference between a feature and part of the Webpack runtime to us. They're interchangeable. That's how we
Yeah. Yeah.
integrate with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And once you look into like what Webpack kind of outputs, right, you also understand like because there is Webpack is still present, right? It's not that it's just as you said, like just a build tool and that just disappears, but there's pieces around that kind of load it dynamically and runtime and stuff. And yeah, the orchestration part is actually a good segue into the main topic today, is like kind of the module federation aspect of it, right? Like in that Webpack specific community, like you are like the creator of that module federation part, right? Of the orchestration inside Webpack and how that works. So for those like that never have heard about module federation with Webpack, like what is it? Like what is it? What is the main goal of it? And just like as a good intro to then like continue to talk on it.
Yeah, sure. So, um, a little bit of history, and this will kind of make sense as how we ended up here, was I had done the whole React Universal component. So that ability to server-side render, code split, and everything still works together. Um, One of my first jobs in the US, I was working at a company where we had about 150 micro front ends, and we had to use like externals and other things to try and like tame the dependency trees. And any page could have up to 30 micro frontends on it at any given point. And that's kind of where I saw the big problem with micro frontends, where externals is too hard to manage, it's too inefficient, and we were really coupled to this NPM based workflow. So I call it the double deploy. Oh, if I want to release this new header, I have to publish the header, then turn around, go to the consumer, install the consumer, and publish the consumer. And if you get 3 levels down, it now, I mean, it's not crazy to hear that publishing a micro front end through an NPM workflow can take up to 3 hours. I've got to publish it here, turn around, publish it there, QA that, turn around, publish it there, and that whole amount of dev time that's consumed can easily be half of your day just to get one package throughout the company. So, anyway, when I saw all of this happening, the question kind of came up as like, well, since I've already done the whole dynamic importing thing, why can't I dynamic import chunks from another build? And that's really the kind of concept of it. And so essentially, the very simple way to put it is Module Federation allows you to import chunks that come from a different Webpack compile altogether. Instead of having to load the entire bundle in, if I just want the header or a certain feature, like let's say I want the add to cart capabilities from my checkout application, all I want is the React code that's add to cart and the hooks. I don't want React. I don't want all the other dependencies I already have. I just want the one chunk that I don't have in my code base. And Federation allows me to intelligently load what I'm missing and recycle what I already have, and just pull in the bare minimum code required to run this application. And I can do it at runtime instead of at build time.
But so the application itself, you kind of still treat it. So this goes in the direction of like micro frontends, right? But you still treat applications as a whole block. But it's just that the single features you pull them in, like you use it as that modular orchestration library at runtime to pull in things dynamically. But it's still one app, right? That you build. Like
Yeah, so
it is
this has
kind of
been
micro frontend if you want, right? But like it's not how we probably think about micro frontends.
It's not traditional micro front end,
yeah,
I would say. It's not how we've thought of it in the past. And so the reason I kind of like this approach, and also this is just a design preference of how I build them, because what I wanted was many builds that act as one. I don't want to mount a whole bunch of DOM nodes onto different places in the document, which I can do with Federation as well, and just use the sharing mechanism to say, don't download React 10 times or do all of that, but you could still do old school mount 10 apps onto 10 DOM nodes and it'll work just fine. But I prefer the single app tree, because what I want is all the benefits that I get of a monolith. I want context buses. I want to be able to communicate up and down this tree, but I want all the benefits of micro frontend as well. So where can I draw that line in between where I still have a single render, so it's still super efficient. I'm not having to mount several nodes everywhere or rehydrate everything incrementally. But, it's a single app tree. It behaves how you would expect it to behave. You can still communicate across it with non-primitives, so I can pass a function to the header. I don't have to use, like, browser event and send a string. But I still want all the autonomy that we get out of micro. The other big benefit that I see or the reason that I use this kind of design principle is it also gives you better governance, because when we get into micro frontends, user experience often suffers, because now you can install any version of whatever you want. You've got part of the app in Angular, part in Vue, part in React, and that just wrecks performance and also increases cost to company, because now you're developing utilities and libraries that you can't actually recycle between the business. I've got Angular one and a React one and a Vue one, then I've tripled the cost to deliver, and my hiring becomes really challenging. I can't interchange my entire engineering team into any team that needs more capacity. I have to hire certain skills for different JavaScript things. So there's the company benefit of kind of the single app design, but there's also just the performance aspects of it. Everybody needs to be on React 18 or on React whatever. So now tech debt starts to get enforced by the architecture. It's no longer, this tough ask to the business about, well, we need to go and clean up our code or, not stay on React 15 or whatever still, but we need to kind of align. The Federation is a mechanism you can use to leverage alignment. The architecture demands alignment. You can't just abandon the code base and leave it for years. You have to look after it. And engineers usually find that's the biggest battle.
Yeah, it's very interesting because like all these arguments are very much like what we kind of preach as we talk about monorepos, right? And specifically how we in NX kind of implement what we call the integrated type of monorepos, where you have like a single version policy, you have like a top level package JSON, right? Where exactly to mitigate such issues as you say, like where you have like one React version across the code base. And obviously it has trade-offs, right? Because that means, well, I have two apps in there. I need to migrate kind of both of them, right? And we support that. Like we help that out in NX with automated migrations and stuff, right? But that's kind of detail. But the thing is, like you invest a little over time, always again, right? And probably as you migrate and update React 18, you kind of already know the kind of issues that you face, right? It's much easier to fix them at that point, right? Rather than doing the same investment, right? In like more distant time blocks, right? Maybe you upgrade one app now and the other one in a year, right? Where it's even a different person. So it's like you lose a lot of that knowledge, right? So it's very interesting because like what you describe, it's kind of very similar along those lines as like probably at runtime or the single application architecture, where the monorepo that we kind of preach and propose and talk about is more across multiple applications. And the other thing that I also kind of find cool is that I'm very much on the same page in the sense that module federation allows you to do those micro front ends, right? But and many people ask about that, right? Oh, we want to deploy independently, right? Even if they use monorepos in NX and stuff, right? And then they talk about microfronts immediately, right? And we usually tell them like, look, like maybe you don't want to do the immediate jump like all the way down, right? So maybe just going a couple of steps. For instance, like what we propose right now in NX, also just use module federation to split up the build times, right? To kind of decompose your app into multiple applications, and then kind of have like build them individually, incrementally with the caching and stuff, right? But still have that integrated experience of developing as if it was one app entirely, right? And so once we show that to people, and that's very powerful, right? Then they're like, oh yeah, that works for us, right? We don't actually need to deal with all that overhead of like independent deployability and aggregation at runtime and stuff. So it's very interesting how flexible on one side that module federation is as well, right?
Yeah, the I think the other thing nobody really knows about this, I mean, it's kind of common sense to me, but I guess I've never told anyone about it, so I can see how everybody's kind of missed it. But I have this kind of thing that I build out, which is essentially like monorepo federation concept, because you can use multiple instances of module federation plugin on a single build. So in some cases where I need to say, like, I have a personalization, analytics, and A/B testing repo. It's all one repo, but it's got three Webpack Federation plugins, each with their own name, each with their own remote
Mm-hmm.
entry. Each of them
Yeah.
has a different share scope, and each of them expose different things. So from one repo, it will push out almost like a monorepo of remotes, where now I can say at Lululemon Analytics, at Lululemon this, that, and the other thing. It's all from one build or from one kind of repo, but it's multiple federation plugins that each have a slightly different scope. Um, and in general, what I would say is like if you're trying to get into it, I think the strategy of using federation with a monorepo is a really good initial step, because if you're if you're already inside of kind of a monorepo space, usually the problems that I start to see is there's some weird coupling between the monorepo itself. Like, I have this one package I never ship anywhere, but it's kind of like the shared code package. If I split this into two repositories, what happens to the shared code? How do I actually pull it into both monorepos to still run?
Yeah.
So, a good kind of crawl, walk, run strategy is get a good incremental build system running, use it as you can, and you only really need to go to the autonomous level if the pipeline is starting to become the bottleneck again. So if you can get
Yeah.
away with the monorepo structure and just split up the build increments and split up like the consumption aspect of it, then federation is really good. And you can also start to prepare how would we split this so that it can be consumed in other parts of the code base, or as individual deployments. But it's almost like precursor work. Everything that you do in the current structure, just pivot it slowly so that if you ever want to split it, what you've invested so far has positioned you in a place where you could pretty much drag and drop a folder into a different monorepo, hit start, and you're back in production in 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Very much like what we currently propose. And like in the monorepo, the nice thing is like if you push a lot of the logic like downwards to so-called like packages, even if they're not reusable like globally, but like at an application level, you can really just use the module federation aspect on top to aggregate and integrate the pieces, right? So the module federation is really just the build step that pulls things together at an application level, and you pull in the features from the kind of library parts of the Monorepo. And I've actually
Yeah,
shared a
like
link on the chat for people that are listening to follow along. We published a blog post about it as well as like a video, which is specific to Angular in that case, but like we have another one like one-to-one basically applies also to React because it's a generic concept, right? It's not something like specific to one single framework.
yeah, that's the I think that's the gift and the curse of federation that everybody kind of gets wrong when they look at it compared to something like say single spa or
Mm-hmm.
Parial or some of the other things that have been out for a while is uh, all I designed it to do is to import code. That's it. That's its only job. It links the
Yeah.
dependency graphs together. It doesn't help you orchestrate anything at the higher level. If you want to break your code, Webpack is more than happy to break, just like, Xcode. It's happy to break your build, but it's up to you to kind of, it's not a framework. But the benefits
Yeah.
of that is there's an immense amount of control because we're not making any opinionated assumptions. All we do is link the graph. What you want to do with it is up to you. So it works with pretty much anything capable of running the JavaScript runtime and beyond that, because we actually have Federation on the back end that works with. We've been able to use Module Federation to pull in Java, .NET, C, and Python code. So we actually are
Nice.
using it in Polyglot, where Webpack is purely the delivery system for lower level code bases.
Cool. Cool. Very interesting. Yeah, in fact, like, and we kind of like now some of my now colleagues and the next core team members and you and a couple of other folks have been talking quite a lot like offline in the past because we were looking into modification. We implemented it for Angular and React, and one of the things that always kind of came up like in the past was, well, okay, how do I server side render as well? Like, how does that work on the server side, right? How does that thing? And I know that one of our engineers working on a client kind of had that question, and so he started really digging deep and started to implement some of the part, like a POC of how that could work, and even got it running. At the same time, then we kind of synced up by accident mostly on Twitter. And like you mentioned, well, I'm currently working on a Node plugin. I was like, oh, wait a minute, like that's what we've been doing as well, right? And so we synced up, and it turned out like, it was pretty similar actually. But obviously, from our perspective, we were super happy because like we don't, from an X perspective, we don't really want to maintain kind of plugin like a low-level Webpack plugin on our own if we don't need to. We're more like from the tooling aspect, we want to make the best integration possible, right? So that said, like let's dive a bit into that part because I know that in the past, like us talking offline, like you've been working on like node-based Webpack module federation, right? Next.js based one. So let's segue maybe into that, like how that got started. And I think that you also open sourced it, right? Like how did that story go?
Yeah, so I guess the main thing, so I'm in e-commerce, so server-side rendering is the bread and butter. Like, there's no
Absolutely.
way around it. Um,
People try to
the
avoid it,
other
but like there's no way around it. Yes.
exactly like what I am seeing a good trend in the front end space start to emerge, and I've seen this in like from Android apps to Java. I forgot what Java uses. I think it's like Swift UI or I can't
That could be,
remember.
yeah.
Java FX, that's it. Even
Oh yeah.
like, so all of these front end systems, they're all starting to kind of transition toward a hybrid rendering approach. And so I see that's probably where we're going to go. And we can see this with React Suspense. Well, I don't need a one for one server render. Some things can be rendered the client, and only certain parts should be rendered on the server. So we're getting more out of the whole everything has to be SSR'd one for one scenario. And that's the direction we should go in. But um, in any case, I think one of the impediments to Federation's adoption has been it's magical in the front end, but as soon as you get to the server side, you're kind of stuck. And there's no like simple convention up till now to make it run server side. And usually when we're looking at a server side application, you pretty much are constrained to the lowest common denominator, which is Node. So I can't do anything that the browser can understand if Node isn't able to at least process it. So half the power is gone because the Node environment isn't capable of doing the one thing you need it to do. And so you just can't, like, Suspense. Well, you can do it in the browser, but we haven't been able to use Suspense for the majority of our careers if we have an SSR app because Suspense won't work on the server. And, we've been stuck kind of like in the 2015 era of React ever since, and suspense has been out for a long time. So anyway, getting to Federation server side, that was like a big one for me, a big one for the community to need, and it was actually one of the first things that we wrote. So when Webpack was still in beta, I think it was beta 15. So it was literally, we wrote Federation, and then like a week later, we wrote the server side implementation for it. And
Nice.
we pretty much just stashed it in like a proprietary code base to just hold on to it for a while. And then we like picked it up incrementally and progressed it a little forward and so on. And then somewhere in the early days, we got a copy that got leaked. So one of our first betas got leaked onto the internet, and that is essentially all the plugins that you've seen on NPM that do Node Module Federation. They're all based on that leaked beta that we leaked out almost 3 years ago. And they haven't really changed much, which is why my implementation looks really similar to the other ones, because they're all my implementation.
But, I see. That makes a whole lot of sense.
So that's why they look similar, is because they're all still based on the first iteration that we had done. But so then, yeah, I kept it all closed source. I think the main reason is I needed a funding pipeline to actually move the ecosystem forward. I've got to hire whole teams of engineers and UX designers and everything to help build out this ecosystem, and that doesn't come free. So I needed some kind of funding gateway, and the Next.js stuff, due to the complexity of it, was a really easy pipeline, and the server-side rendering, because usually the big enterprises needed it and would go through the procurement process to acquire the intellectual property needed for it. As time has gone on, I think probably in the last couple weeks, I switched all my proprietary works that aren't patented to open source, and the main reason is we have gotten I can't mention who they are just yet, but we've gotten one of the major tech firms, one of the FANG level companies, are now backing the technology, specifically Node Federation and Next.js Server Federation. Cool. Due to just the challenges of working with like a trillion-dollar company, the procurement process and the legal issues around a private repo that company dedicates resources to is really complicated. So after going through, the loop with the legal and everybody, what we kind of came to was the easiest way to solve this is to just switch to an MIT license and make it open source. And then I can get access to trillion-dollar company resources to help me engineer this thing and maintain it. And for me, I feel I've laid the funding pipeline enough to get where we need to get. I've got some other things in the works that will hopefully replace that revenue stream to keep it moving forward. But at this point, I think the best thing for the ecosystem is to get a major tech firm backing it, get that logo onto the README, and it will unlock a whole lot more adoption. And so that's kind of why I switched over to open sourcing it. I had always planned to do it. It was just, I'd planned to do it in like 2 or 3 months from now. And it just got expedited by the opportunity.
Nice. Yeah, like the funding aspect, like, so I always say like open source is very cool because like obviously as developers benefit a lot from it, right? But obviously it needs to be sustainable. So if someone like needs to like invest a lot of his personal time without having any funding and just doing it on the side, the quality you get out of that is also kind of much different, right? Rather than if you can like at least get some out of it, like also financially and kind of help pushing that forward and hire folks that help out and stuff. So very cool to hear
I mean, like to put in perspective, I think even with the funding helped a lot from those commercial plugins, but even so, the investment that I've put in so far has been, I think, around $100,000 to date into the ecosystem. And that's like out-of-pocket investment. So that's not funds I've recuperated, but that's been the challenge, is it's something that I believe in, and it's something that we need, and at the end of the day, somebody's got to pay the price. And I'm just too stubborn to accept the ecosystem that we've got. And, I mostly just want it for me, and I'm happy that it benefits everyone else. So I'll just do it for my own sake of mind.
Nice. So talking about like the integration, like from Webpack, the client side aspect, and then the server side aspect, I think like a lot of people think about that. Like, how does it work? Like, what are the challenges on the server sides? Like, how do they integrate? Like, maybe you can kind of transition, like what happens, like if I have my server side random Webpack Module Federation setup and kind of load the page,
Yeah.
right? So
So this is actually extremely elegant. Well, so how the server-side thing works itself is everybody thinks it's like magic, but it's a very simple mechanism that I've taken advantage of. So inside of Webpack, when you use the async node target for build, when Webpack goes to require something, what it's using is fs read file and VM run in this context. So to make federation work on Node, I don't need HTTP imports or anything like that. All Webpack expects is that I'm going to give it a string that comes from a promise, and that string is a valid Webpack chunk. So to make federation work on the server, all I had to do was change the runtime module that's Webpack's file system functions and say, if the file doesn't exist, create a readable stream and fetch it from the remote container inside of a secure S3 bucket or something like that. And then pipe the readable stream back into UTF-8 and pass it to run in this context. And there you go. Webpack doesn't know any different. No framework can really stop this from working because it's not framework specific. Every framework uses require. If Webpack controls what the file system is, no framework has any idea that this didn't come from disk. And that's essentially how the magic is done. It's a very simple concept, but it's a very powerful one. When we transition from client to server side, there are some interesting aspects to it. One, you need obviously a common JS flavored build for the server to understand. So like with Next.js or anything else, when you do a build, it's actually two builds. One is the browser land build and one is the server side build. I use common JS target because it's the most compatible with everything.
so
Next is still common JS server side. And there's also some advantages to the common JS convention on the server. The main one is ESM only works with ESM. So there's a couple, challenging things that bundlers can kind of re-encapsulate the code, and ESBuild kind of does that. But the other big one is, especially for federation on the server, I need a convention for hot reloading production. And ESM doesn't have any access to the module cache. So I have no way to get a module out other than to leak memory really heavily and put a query string on the end of all my imports so that I just fill memory up forever. So it's not a very... so at least with CommonJS, it can still leak memory, but I haven't seen it leak more than 10 megabytes over a couple of weeks. But at least with CommonJS, I can just reset the require cache. And now require is empty, and it re-requires everything off of disk, and one of them is the Webpack runtime. Webpack runtime is now empty, and it fetches all the chunks again that it needs from wherever they come from, and now I've effectively hot reloaded production without ever tearing it down. So that's the one aspect, is how do I make sure that once I've imported a remote, it doesn't get stuck because the server is still online. And Webpack will think, well, I already dynamically imported this remote, I have the chunk, why would I go over the network to get the chunk again? Similar to when you do it in the browser. You don't see 10 dynamic imports for the same file. It does it one time and everything else sees it's there and just uses what's in memory. So that was aspect number one. The second aspect is we need the concept of flushing out the chunks. And this is more an optimization, not a mandatory thing. But if I say use a federated header, I want the CSS and the JavaScript to be server rendered in the document when I send the payload to the end user. So they don't have to wait for Webpack to kick in the browser, and then Webpack churns around and downloads more JavaScript runtime. But I want it to all be a single request flow. So those are kind of the two core pieces that are needed for the server to client transition, is how do we keep that request just as low as a normal code split app? And how do we ensure that when a remote changes, without needing orchestration, I just want the system to automatically figure out the remote's been updated, download the new copy of the remote, and continue running without needing to create a notification bus or another orchestration layer that can now inform all the servers that they need to do a rolling restart or they need to manually reload themselves. I want it to all be self-contained. So as a front-end developer, I don't need to build out any infrastructure other than an S3 bucket and the Webpack runtime. And the Webpack runtime effectively replaces most of my infrastructure that I would have in a traditional setup. Some of the things maybe you realize, but the big power around federation on the server is the amount of infrastructure you need also drops. So I know a lot of companies where they only redeploy the main server once every 6 months. because everything is federated and hot reloading, the server never needs to be restarted or redeployed. It just lives forever, and as code changes on S3, it just picks it up and uses it on demand. Um, the other cool benefit is like if you think about when you open a pull request for, say, an AWS Lambda, usually what we're doing is we're saying create a zip file, upload the zip file to some, ephemeral URL, and there's the Lambda. You have to have another Lambda backing this pull request. With Federation, all I need is to have a stage Lambda, one Lambda, pretty much. And if I need to test a pull request on it, I can just send that in a head or, in a head request or as a cookie or as a query parameter. As this request gets to the server, I can pick it up and I can pretty much send the instruction set to Webpack and say, hey, you need to load this remote entry from this S3 bucket for this request response. And as soon as you send the reply, hot reload yourself and be ready for the next request from wherever. So I have one Lambda that can simultaneously be multiple code bases at one time, but I don't have a bunch of infrastructure that matches that. One Lambda can be 25 different PRs, 25 different code bases in parallel, without any additional infrastructure. So it solves a lot of infrastructure
That sounds
issues.
very, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, like if you think about it, but I think like that's definitely a use case which not a lot of people dive into like more, right? Because it's really like goes deep into like how like Webpack works underneath, and as well as like modification from a mental perspective works, right? But it's a very fascinating use case actually. Totally.
Yeah, it's useful for like A/B tests or Canary releases or
Oh yeah,
percent
for sure.
rollouts or anything like that, where when we do it at the infrastructure level, we're limited to what the infrastructure can understand. Like if the server doesn't 500, it'll keep serving potentially broken code. But the Webpack runtime is aware if something didn't work correctly because you can talk to it right there. You can say like, hey,
Yeah,
catch
yeah.
or error boundary or whatever. And in that case, you could say, hey, Webpack, this didn't work. On the next invocation, I need you to use the previous remote deploy that was available. And now the system can self-heal itself without the infrastructure needing to send HTTP codes to understand something's wrong and to point you to like the blue instance or whatever.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, what you usually do, like in a fully fledged like setup, right? Like with different, even you could even call those like microservices, because it really like each of those bundles kind of an individual service that is being fetched and pulled from a central coordination mechanism. Very interesting, very cool.
Yeah, I think
Yep.
to distill it into like a one sentence would be, what I'm trying to do is detach the file system bindings from the compute primitive. I want to say, hey, there's a CPU on the internet, and I need this CPU to become GraphQL for this request. And as soon as it
No.
sends the request, I want it to just be a CPU again. And then it could be a Next.js Lambda. It could be whatever I want it to be. But, I could pretty much at random choose any of my instances and say, here's what I need you to be, and it responds with the payload that I want. And after that, like true serverless almost, where it's not coupled to a file system, it's just, here's CPUs on the internet. As you send the request to it, it assumes the role of whatever code base you want it to be.
Cool. Nice. There's one good question that came up in the chat as well, which kind of goes like it goes a bit outside Webpack Module Federation necessarily, but like the person asked basically whether like there are other bundlers, and like you could call them competitors, like depending on how you see it, right? With similar features. Like, do you have any experience in that? Like, have you explored the space, or have you stayed mostly like in the Webpack one?
So this kind of comes back to what I'd said at the initial thing about like why, like the pro and con of modern bundlers. They're faster, but it comes at a very big price, and that's a very weak API. No offense to them. They do what they're supposed to do. They're designed to be quick, they're designed to serve a certain purpose, but that's what they're designed to do. They're not designed to do other things like this. So we just don't have the API surface to implement something like Federation using their compiler APIs. What we are working on, and this is a lot of what Manfred, I don't know if you guys, you
Yeah,
probably know Manfred.
yeah. I was about to segue. This is a good segue into that part as well, right?
So myself, Manfred, and my consulting partner so all the work that I do with enterprise companies, it all goes through Valor Software. They kind of help manage my capacity and everything like that. So myself, Manfred, and Valor are kind of all involved in this thing that we're calling native federation. The concept is we take what Module Federation and Webpack does, and we apply it using native standards or next generation native standards. So we're using import maps and ESM and things like that but we're still keeping everything that Federation does, the sharing mechanism, sharing a singleton, symver parsing of the versions. The whole API is still the same. We're just using import maps and other things like that to make it work. With Native Federation, it's running with ES-build, and there's one now for Vit, and we're going to pull Vit over to make Module Federation /Vit, so it'll be like one of our core official plugins. But I think the big thing there is, so we've been able to do this with native, which unlocks it to any browser standard or any compiler. But how we did it was the compiler APIs are still not strong enough to actually pull it off. So what we had to do was we depend highly on the import map shim. And what we've done is we've moved, similar to what the Webpack runtime does, we've effectively moved the Webpack runtime into the import map shim, the same concept. So we still have this thing of a Webpack runtime. It's just we can't plug runtime modules into something like Rollup or ES-build. So the workaround is we create some way to control the shims for import maps, and we pipe all the logic into that. And that's kind of how we get out of the weak APIs of the bundlers themselves. I'm pretty bullish on the native Federation tech. One of the main things is, like, I'm not really tied to Webpack. It's just Webpack does it. Webpack can do it, and the other ones can't do it as elegantly out the box. Like, we have to depend on a shim, which is totally fine. But that's why I've mostly stuck with Webpack. It's just because it's got everything I could possibly ever want to do, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But there is still, since, I'm not tied to Webpack or want to keep it as a Webpack exclusive, I really do want this to be agnostic everywhere. So, hey, if you don't want to use Webpack, I don't care. The main thing is cool. If we can keep the concept of it, you're getting the benefits of what the tech was supposed to do, which make our life easier. So the native Federation, I'm definitely really bullish on because I think it'll open up a whole different class of like what we can do. There are some challenges that we still have to face in the native space, and one of them is probably going to be the server-side aspects. Because I've got, with Webpack, I have the whole file system augmented. So I control what Webpack believes FS is, or what the app believes FS is, and I can switch between any promise that resolves a string. With native standards, I don't know if we can we don't have that augment layer if we're using ESM, or even if we use like the import map polyfill on Node, we don't have the same level of augmentation. So it will be a little trickier, I think, to land Node support for native Federation. But, from my experience, it's all possible to do. So we'll definitely be able to. It's just, I think in general, the Webpack part of the ecosystem will trail a little bit ahead, just because it's a bit more mature, and we do have the power of Webpack's runtime that we can control. But we're pretty much, when we build it in Webpack, we look at how we did it, and we figure out how do we do this in not Webpack. And a lot of the times when I look at it, I'm just taking pieces of the Webpack runtime, and I'm implementing them in other tools or other bundlers, like just a copy-paste of the code. And there we go, because that's really what I want it to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think like here the maturity of, obviously, as you say, like that kind of plays in, right? Because as you said before, Webpack has been around for a long time. The browser APIs for the native Federation are still kind of young, not like super well supported across the board. They've been probably also kind of a bit rudimentary still, right? But yeah, to the question that has been raised in the chat, like that could be a potential direction to go, right? If you for some reason like want to go with ES-build or Vite or some of the other tools that are out there. And yeah, as you mentioned, like Manfred kind of brought this up. Like I think I first saw it from Manfred. You jumped in then because you had your own ideas as well. And we've been thinking about it as too, because in NX, for instance, like we integrate a lot of different tools, right? That's one of the strengths. Like we look and think about like how do tools integrate in the best way that it works most efficiently for you, and then we come up with some like thin wrappers around them, right? And the fact that we right now, our React application mostly powers Webpack or uses Webpack underneath. We recently added like ES-build as an additional option because a lot of folks start asking about that, right? And so having the support already now in NX for Webpack Module Federation, when we added ES-build, we were like, we should have a solution for that as well, right? And it is nice that the timing is very, very good right now, because like Manfred came along then with the native federation, and you started like chiming in those discussions. There's some good stuff going on there. So yeah, for folks out there, like you can definitely, like there will definitely come some good tooling integration in NX that kind of allows you to switch back and forth between like those options when you use that. Cool.
Yeah, there's no reason that you can't switch between both. I think the only challenge is going to be the interoperability between native ESM and Webpack's runtime system that it uses, which I think we can still solve because we have the import map shim. So, but that's still something we have to figure out, is how do we like bind them back together? Because Webpack's native ESM target is still, it's still a little bit further out, and it's still very much like Webpack based. So the chunks are just export const the module IDs. It's not like rollup where it preserves the modules and it's all pure ESM. It's still wrapped in the Webpack runtime wrappers. So there's some work to figure out how we like create a binding back so that they're interoperable between each other, but it's definitely possible to do, and it's something we're going to get to eventually.
Nice. And talking about your open source packages, I think right now we talked a bit before the show as well. Like this is the main repo where you're currently working at, right? And I think like it has the Next.js implementation as well as the Node package. But you mentioned also that you're like currently like migrating this over to like a monorepo. I think you believe you use NX for that, so that like that's a cool part of that. Like, can you talk a bit about the story, how that is going to be, or where people can follow along if they want to kind of be on your shoulder while you keep this evolving on the source level, basically?
So Twitter is obviously the best place to see what's going on. If you want to see like the code in action, everything's happening under that Next.js MF repo right now. The repo has now folded into an NX workspace, and I'm going to rename the repo at some point in the future and probably call it like Module Federation slash plugins. The main reason I started there is because I use Next at work. So all the investment and time that I'm putting into it is the Next ecosystem. As I build out that Next ecosystem, I realize I've built a ton of utilities that are useful for not Next apps. So I wanted a way to not have to maintain like the 20 repos that I have to maintain, but I just want to have Module Federation utilities. And hey, if you want to do remote injection, use my utility and it's all managed the Webpack to Webpack specifications. Or the Node plugin, Next.js MF would fork the Node plugin and bring a copy of it in there, and then I would change it as needed. And I would end up with the Node plugin not being updated ever, and all the new stuff being added here. So I cut over to NX and pretty much just to consolidate it all. So I'd much rather, since all of these things depend on themselves in various ways, if I break them into more packages, I can maintain the whole ecosystem out of a central place, and I can progress everything in like a more sane pattern. And the only thing left is it's no longer Next.js MF, because that's just a package under this repo. But, I just now sunset
There's the challenge of
Module
naming
Federation
now, right?
node repo. Yep. And so I still need to rename the main repo, but when I do, if GitHub doesn't redirect it, I'll open up another GitHub like repo with the old name, and I'll just say this has been renamed to, and I'll point to whatever the new repo name is. So you'll still be able to follow it wherever it goes, and I'll just rename the current repo, so if you start or watch it, it should persist. But that's where everything's mostly going to be happening. We're going to pull in the TypeScript Federation support as well into that repo, and probably a couple other things are going to go in there. But that's going to kind of be the main place where if it's not an entire ecosystem on its own, it's going to be under that repository where I add all the packages and variants and everything.
Nice. And one thing that I also actually wanted to dive in, and now basically someone asked on the chat, like online, is like I know that you've been working also on a tool called Medusa, right? And so a person asked you, like, can you talk a bit more about like what Medusa is, like in the context of Webpack Module Federation, like what it can do, why you would need it, and maybe some plans on it?
So I guess the first thing is we did launch Medusa. We're still rolling features to it, so it's like still in active development, but it's production capable currently. So it's out there if you want to try it out. It's just http medusa.codes. That's the URL for it. And what Medusa is, and it's also not just Webpack, we are finalizing support and integration with Native Federation as well. So it will work with Native Federation and it works with Webpack Federation. What Medusa is it's essentially, I refer to it as the central brain for distributed architecture. similar to how you would have Kubernetes for Docker, or an ingress of some kind. We've got Medusa, which what happens during build is we report the build graph to Medusa. We don't report your source code or anything like that. We just report who uses what, where, and how is it used, and what versions are being used. So now we have kind of like the Webpack stats for your build available. And now if we have that for the entire company, we can correlate how do these two different repos consume what they're consuming? What's the bundle size of them? We see you have 8 versions of Lodash installed at different versions. Maybe consider sharing them or bumping them all to one single version. But the main thing that it does is it allows us to visualize a federated application. So I can see who consumes what and where. Like, okay, I have header, and header consumes this, which consumes analytics, which consumes that. And you can kind of see the visual breakdown of how things are consumed and where they're consumed. The other big one that we've added in there is, like its main feature right now, is the concept of remote module management. So what it does is it allows Webpack to communicate with Medusa at execution time and ask Medusa, what should I do? So instead of me putting a hard-coded URL to a remote entry in there, the call is an API call to Medusa saying, I'm this host, I'm looking for this remote, and I'm in this environment. And then Medusa will respond and say, here's the remote entry, and here's the namespace the remote entry is under. And so usually what I'll use is like a commit hash as the namespace. So I don't even know the name of header. It's not window.header like in simple federation ones. It's literally the commit hash. So now I can support multiple copies of a library on the page at different versions at the same
And
time.
a registry of your remotes, like of your pieces.
It's like a lot.
It's very interesting because
Webpack.
Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting because
And
I've back in the days, like when I did like Java and backend development as well, like there have been similar concepts where you kind of have like a registry where you invoke like dynamically which service to invoke. Like that's even kind of a load balancing. And it's very interesting in this way similarly, right? Because you have kind of that registry which you kind of invoke and load in the modules dynamically. And also the visualization aspect, I feel it's very cool. Like it's kind of similar to the NX graph when you use it just at like development time, but this kind of at runtime, right? Where you see
this is at runtime, and it's connected through sockets. So as apps get deployed, you can just sit on the dashboard and you'll see it change in real time in front of you as things happen. Things that we're planning to do in this space are, so we already have version management, which is the big one, because I want to be able to say, have stage be at the latest, and I want production to be at a pinned version. Like for checkout, I don't want checkout just to take the latest code. I want some kind of gate in there. I want that NPM guarantee. It's immutable. It won't change on you, but I don't want to have to use the NPM workflow to get it, because I don't need to restart the server just to say use a new copy of the header. I just need to change what the dependency link is on the next invocation. So Medusa fills a good gap of bridging that level of dynamic power that Federation gives you, but taming it in a way that's manageable and safe. Some of the things that we're adding, and this is kind of really where the power starts to increase, is with Medusa, if we connect it to, say, A/B testing, or like Launch Darkly, now you can feature flag anything that you want through Medusa, through Launch Darkly in real time without ever needing to change the code, but you can effectively change the whole dependency tree of a code base on a request by request base. I mean, imagine if your code, we have personalized features. What if you had personalized source code where the code base can be personalized to a certain user one-to-one without needing any change or any additional lambdas running, again, reducing that infrastructure overhead. The other big thing is think about error correction. When there's a critical failure, how do you fix the problem? Even if you have something like either you have a lot of spare lambdas sitting around, or you have to have still spare lambdas sitting around, so when one of them breaks, you could switch over to like a green-blue instance. So, or even the auto rollback. Any way that you look at it, switching between a broken deploy and a working version that's still around takes time, and it's very low fidelity. Unless it's 500ing, there's no quick way for me to automatically understand something's wrong and point you to a piece of infrastructure where it's not wrong. With Medusa, since this is wired directly into Webpack's runtime, we have all the information Webpack has as it's working. And similar to how Webpack works with my feature code, Webpack and Medusa can work hand in hand during build time and during runtime. So if it throws an error, I can send that to Sentry, and Sentry can have a webhook that pings Medusa saying, this remote is failing in this host, and within 2 seconds, Medusa can change the version that host is consuming of that remote and pretty much automatically repair your production code base with no
Nice.
human intervention needed. And then send a webhook off to your Slack channel saying, this is you're currently running in self-healing mode. You need to go and repair it. And where I see it kind of coming more beneficial is we can start to bridge together what does a deployment mean? Because a deployment usually is built around the idea that I have to bind to the file system. So I need a zip file, I have to do everything I need for that zip file, upload it to the object store, and then when I'm ready to go to production, I move that zip file out of the object store onto a machine and seal it, and it's done. So for that whole process to work, your CI pipeline is really slow. You have to do all your end-to-end tests, you have to do all your linting, because you're going to create an artifact that's ready to be merged to prod, and you can't create that artifact unless you know everything is good. Under Medusa, we can shorten that loop time, where I can say, just do the build and get it into S3, and then if I try to put this in a higher environment, we can say, okay, well, when you try to say, okay, update to, commit hash whatever in production, we can put in quality gates where we can say, okay, pending release. And then we could send another ping back and say, okay, now start running the end-to-end tests. So if I'm doing it in stage, just show it as quick as I can. Give me a 60-second build because I'm busy working. I don't care if the tests are all passing right now. I just need some things you can only
get it
test
done
in a
some
real
staging environment as quick as possible, right? To run some high-level tests.
Like for me, a lot of my work happens on the deployed environments. And if I have to spend 20 minutes each commit waiting for it, it's really slow. So usually when I have to do development like that, I turn off, I echo zero every other task in CI except for the build and the Lambda upload to get it down to be like 2 minutes to get it into an environment. With something like Medusa, we can say, well, only do all of those sanity checks and all that other stuff when you're requesting to point to this in production. So now you can get this stuff out really quick, and then you could say, okay, Medusa, I want to upgrade it. There's a gate on here that does like a double verify where it sends a ping to like a Jenkins box or to your infrastructure and says, start running the end-to-end tests and my unit tests. If all of that passes, send me a webhook back saying version, commit hash X passed, and then Medusa will automatically upgrade it. And until then, it'll send us like almost like a merge train. It's pending everything to pass, and then it will switch you over automatically. So, if we do all of that, it reduces the CI time, the developer loop time, and it gives us a bunch of interesting options because we could say, use the single sign-on from Medusa, create a Chrome extension, and say, in production, I want to test the new copy of header that's on stage. Now I can override Medusa just for me and have production respond with staging code just for my user, not for anybody else who's hitting production. I don't need more lambdas in production to run it. I can hot reload production, have it serve my one request, and then reset itself back to the stable version of it. And being able to do all of that through a Chrome extension where you can change and test and prod safely, that's a really big thing that traditionally hasn't really been
obviously
possible.
once you have like that kind of infrastructure in place, like there's a lot of things where you can just like plug in, right? So very, very, very cool. I want to be mindful of the time, so we are right like an hour in. Before we leave, I just wanted to plug a couple things also on our side, which is here mostly first of all NXConf. So we've been announcing this. We've announced this for quite a while now. It's happening almost in a month, right? It's on October 17th. It is in person in Tempe, Arizona. So if you can make it to the in-person event, I would highly recommend. We were planning a small edition this year, basically in Arizona, and we have a larger conf like in 2023, where we'll have like 2 days and much more speakers. So we kind of have like a more VIP setup this time. Plus, we just added also completely free online attendance. And at that NXConf, we kind of talk about monorepos, all the kind of dev tooling, Lerna. And we also have a talk about Webpack Module Federation and how we use it and how we like help like people speed up things in the monorepo scenario. So definitely come in and check that out. The next thing specifically to Module Federation is check out our blog. A lot of the things which we talked today about is exactly how like Module Federation works, but not just only for the micro front end goal, like the very end goal probably, but even just for speeding up things. And so we created a blog post on our blog a while back. There's a video as well, a video walkthrough, if you prefer the video version of it, which is mostly the same thing as in the article here, just walks you through step by step. Now this is for Angular. We'll have something for React as well, but like between us, it's kind of just like changing the framework underneath. Like the concept is exactly the same. In the next, the commands are exactly the same. It's really like you wouldn't even notice at the high level. So, and for catching those videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, and that's currently where we add a lot of the content. You have like the live streams as we do right now, but we also kind of push out a lot of like small bite-sized 2-minute-ish videos about various concepts around NX module federation and all that kind of stuff. So definitely make sure you have a look at that and let us know. Zack, thanks a lot for being on the show. When people want to follow along with you, where do they best go? Where do they kind of get in touch with you?
Scripted Alchemy. That'll be it. My Twitter handle, my GitHub handle, everything on the internet is Scripted Alchemy, so you can find me anywhere on any platform under that handle. And
Cool.
that would be the best place to find me. I'm most active on Twitter. It's pretty much like that's where everything happens. If somebody needs to work with me on something and I don't reply on Slack, I tell them message me on Twitter and I'll reply in a second. So if you want the real-time stuff, Twitter is going to be the best place to get hold of me.
Nice, very cool. Yeah, we'll make sure that to add those into the show notes so whoever is watching can kind of find it there. Thanks a lot for being on the show. I hope we can do a future edition because like there's a lot of integrations coming up. I can already take that now or say that now that between NX, the work you do, the work Manfred does on native module federation stuff. So there's some good stuff coming up already in the pipeline on the next side as well. So maybe we can do some show and go more into the code level in the future and show some stuff.
What I'm hoping that we will be able to do is I'm working with AWS on something called front-end discovery, which is essentially like a service mesh. We're trying to create an official schema that describes micro front-ends and the infrastructure. So the idea would be you put a JSON schema and you run your build. Webpack respects that JSON schema and it powers module federation, also powers native federation, and it sets up your cloud infrastructure, your S3 buckets, the Lambda runtimes, Route 53, all of that from one single description location. So you can just hit CDK deploy, and AWS natively takes this thing in and stands up all your infrastructure with like a similar to a Versal deploy with Versal button. You would have the schema that can set up, you know, complex AWS or Azure or Cloudflare with, you know, one standard schema that works across single SPA, federation, like all the micro things we're trying to align it across. One thing I think would be really neat in the future is looking at all these integrations coming up. It would be really cool to look at collaborating to create something like an NX federation plugin where we can wire into your project JSON natively, and instead of using module federation, we could write a custom plugin for NX repos that utilizes your ecosystem and generators and everything else, and it respects your standard way of working. So now Webpack just respects the NX project JSON, and everything is configured like through your standard way.
Yeah. That's
So
I mean, in the end,
really
like in the end, like the Angular module federation that we have implemented, it's basically that, right? Like so, you have it Webpack integrated into the integrates like kind of monorepo setup that NX provides you. So it's baked by the generators and executors. So like you don't necessarily have to know there's Webpack module federation underneath, right? You make it very, very easy. So yeah, like I'm looking forward to such a show in the future. That would be really cool to stop going a bit more into like the details of the code base and kind of hack on some example code. So let's talk about that. Thanks again for being on the show, and we'll keep chatting. Thanks, everyone.